It's my great pleasure now to introduce Miriam Wilms. And she is a visceral surgeon from Düsseldorf. She is also a public health researcher, but more importantly, she's a patient representative from the German patient organization ZOMA, which is specializes in support for Hirschsprung and ARM patients. And over to Miriam. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. Good afternoon. I usually talk more about colorectal conditions, so I feel very privileged to have moved up in the gastrointestinal tract for today. ZOMA and KEGS have partnered and grown together in the advocacy for centralization of care for the last decades, I would say. And we are indeed a very strong alliance. We've faced tough discussions together. We have performed research together. We have found an amazing network of supporters. But most importantly, we've not made any progress for those children being born today. The transferability of children with EA to centers of expertise has been clearly shown in previous studies and is recommended by the ENICA framework. Yet the yearly average of roughly 200 corrective surgeries for EA in Germany were performed in 102 different hospitals in 3 years, in a 3-year time period, with 6 hospitals performing a minimum annual caseload of 5 corrective surgeries a year, and 47 hospitals performing 1 or fewer surgeries per year. This is hospital discharge data, and it includes gastric transposition, and it includes redo surgery. The problem of decentralization is not unique to pediatric surgery, and in other specialties, we hopefully look at university hospitals as centers of expertise. However, in pediatric surgery, it is unique that the majority of university hospitals are low-volume hospitals for the corrective surgery for EA. In this work by Lacher et al., 11 out of the 19 hospitals had a median annual caseload of 2 EA corrective surgeries, and the so-called high-volume hospitals had a median annual caseload of 8. Similar distributions of caseloads are observed for all malformations. Let's consider the Big 10 of pediatric surgery. Of the total of 158 participating hospitals, only 31 hospitals achieved a minimum annual caseload of 5 for any of the malformations. So 127 of the participating hospitals performed less than 5 corrective surgeries for all the Big 10. Of the 31 locations displayed here, 13 had a minimal annual caseload of 5 for only 1 malformation and 12 for 2 malformations. Thus, we see that the centers for the care of 1 malformation are usually low-volume hospitals for other malformations, and there are no high-volume hospitals for the entire spectrum. Why is this consideration important? One of the main arguments of the German Society of Pediatric Surgery in the ongoing discussions about the current health reform is that caseload might be small for the corrective surgery of 1 malformation, but the sum of all corrective surgeries is sufficient to provide high-quality care. Now, firstly, the data doesn't show that. And secondly, do you really learn how to perform colorectal surgery from performing esophageal surgery? Why is the care situation for complex malformations so decentralized in Germany? There are many reasons, but one is the German legislative regulation for quality control in neonatology that since 2005 mandates perinatal centers of the highest level to have a pediatric surgeon available. That seems quite reasonable from a neonatological perspective, but just to clarify the impact of this regulation on the unregulated pediatric surgery. The care structure of the 1,600 cases of complex malformations in Germany per year is now linked to the care structure of about 7,000 very low birth weight premature infants. The problem is the incidence is just so different, and the need of newborns with complex malformations go beyond a good neonatal care. The neonatal care structure in Germany is highly regulated. There are quality assurance procedures, voluntary certifications, a mandatory structural requirement, a nationwide mandatory minimal caseload, and a transparency list with case numbers for the treatment of very low birth weight infants. In contrast, there is a complete lack of quality assurance measures in pediatric surgery. As a consequence, children with complex malformations in Germany are operated in hospitals where there are excellent, quality-assured, centralized neonatal structures, but completely unregulated, decentralized pediatric surgical units. Patient organizations have alarmed about low quality of care in pediatric surgery for decades, but since that went unheard, we probably need to do something different. Scientifically, all of this comes down to investigating a volume-outcome relation, in this case for EA. And just recently, I sat next to a renowned pediatric surgeon on a panel discussion with EU representatives in the room on centralization of care, and he said, "We only operated one case of biliary atresia a year, but it always went well." Now, this argument is problematic on a stage with health policymakers listening, and it is certainly problematic in academia, and I would just like to give an overview. Seifert et al. Used the French EA registry to analyze EA surgical outcomes over a 2-year period. They had an average of 154 cases per year performed in 38 hospitals. 24 had less than 5 cases per year, 13 had more than 5 cases but less than 10, and 1 hospital had 11 cases per year. Despite this overall low caseload, Seifert et al. Conclude caseload experience does not significantly affect the survival of patients with EA. Our study showed clearly that low levels of experience might be sufficient, as no difference in survival was noted in centers with fewer than 5 new cases. There are similar studies conducted for Hirschsprung disease. Apfel et al. Had a median annual case volume of 1.4 procedures. Over half of infants were treated at hospitals that had performed an average of less than 10 HT pull-throughs per year during the preceding 2 years. Yet the authors conclude neither surgeon volume nor hospital volume were significantly associated with readmission or reoperation rates for infants with Hirschsprung disease. And now we've been talking about Sweden a lot, but there's one disadvantage about Sweden. It has a kind of small population size. There's this study from Sweden about comparing the case numbers 5 years before and 5 years after centralization in a single center. Before centralization, 7.2 HD pull-throughs were performed per year, and after centralization, 11.4 HD pull-throughs. 8.3% of patients had a postoperative perforation prior to centralization, and only 3.5% after centralization, yet these results were not significant, as most of the other results. Why? Because the difference in caseload before and after centralization is marginal, and the authors conclude centralization of care does not have a negative impact, and I guess that's kind of diplomatic here. So all these studies come to the conclusion there is no volume outcome relation for complex pediatric surgical operations, and they state it, and politicians read this. But the conclusion is wrong. The only conclusion that can be made is a volume outcome relation cannot be established due to overall low hospital caseload in decentralized healthcare systems, or in the case of Sweden, a centralized country with a small population size. For the malformations CDH and biliary atresia, a correlation between volume and outcome has been demonstrated. For gastroschisis, the correlation has been shown as probable in a large systematic review. And one of my favorite studies is the bottom one, which shows a clear volume outcome relation for something as simple as the implantation of a central venous catheter. So children are affected by volume outcome relationships in general, as is probably everything in this world. But on a more scientific note, one could argue that EA is quite different to biliary atresia, and the results might not really be transferable. So ideally, we would investigate a common condition on the same organ system as subsidiary evidence for EA. However, that does not exist in the pediatric population. There are no common other reasons for an operation on the esophagus in children. Anything other than EA is even rarer. Now, medically, we all know that children are not little adults, but they are not aliens either, because the day they turn 18, they are adults, and from that day on, In Germany, they are protected by a mandatory minimal caseload of 26 esophageal operations per year in hospital. And that is regardless of the underlying diagnosis. So even if that operation was a revision operation for EA. Let us look at the evidence that led to that policy. This is a review by Metzger et al. It is just one of numerous studies, and it summarizes 13 studies that showed a clear volume outcome relation for esophageal surgery in the adults. In those studies, mortality only significantly declined in hospitals with a minimum annual caseload of above 20, and the decline was marginal between hospitals below 5 and hospitals below 10. And this other study I picked just shows that the volume outcome relation is independent of the underlying disease, but really specific to the organ system, esophagus, and could be shown for something as rare as achalasia. The authors conclude, even though it is hard to legislate, volume standards should be implemented for a rare disease such as esophageal achalasia, and centers of excellence should be designated for its treatment. This recommendation might benefit both patients and the US healthcare system. The sum of all this evidence and more led the German legislators to put a mandatory minimal caseload into effect, and I would just like to quote from the reasoning to that decision. The establishment of a minimal volume requirement is necessary as a quality standard that goes beyond medical training and beyond hospital planning regulations. Medical training regulations alone do not ensure the necessary continuous nationwide experience and routine in terms of acquiring practical competencies on corresponding target numbers. And while I leave you to watch this beautiful slide on how things can change, let us get clear on the evidence. Currently, a volume outcome relation cannot be established for corrective surgery for EA due to the rarity, the complexity, and the totally fragmented care structure within Germany. Even in the international context, there are no studies published with centers performing 20 or more EA corrective surgeries per year. There are no common diseases within the pediatric population that could serve as subsidiary evidence for EA. So we need to acknowledge that the evidence from adult esophageal surgery is transferable to the pediatric population, as the type of post-operative complications and the intrinsic challenges of the organ system esophagus are equal. In our strive for centralization, let's stop deviating. We need meaningful health policies now for the children affected today, and let's use the most transparent and most effective tool for centralization there is, and that is case volume. We need to be clear on minimal caseload within the ERNs. We should inform health policymakers about their importance in the current health reform, and clinicians and the scientific community should acknowledge the need for a nationwide mandatory minimal caseload. And just one last note on this slide. So the year 2024, the 40th birthday of Keks, is the first year in which there are less hospitals in Germany, 69 hospitals, performing 4,000 esophageal surgeries for adults. Then there are pediatric surgical units, 120, performing 200 EA surgeries for children. So there is quite some room for improvement. Thank you very much.
So we were just changing the program slightly because the first topic touched the same problem we face. So I guess my first question is, Professor Bührer, you mentioned a lot of problems we have in Germany, but you didn't touch the solutions. So my first question would be, how many centers would we need, and what is the solution to this problem? What would you like to change and how?
Yeah. I would take a microphone.
I don't know. Maybe they're on already.
This one? Okay. There's one good example. This is pediatric heart surgery. We are now down to 21 centers. We would need about 15, but there we are on the right track. And it was possible because the structural requirements were so high that it just didn't make economic sense to have pediatric heart surgery even in many university hospitals. So this is a role model. And about the number of babies requiring open heart surgeries is about twice the number of babies needing major pediatric surgery, everything included. Esophageal atresia, congenital diaphragmatic hernia, and whatsoever, all these major diseases. So if we have 20 centers for pediatric heart surgery, we would need about 10 for pediatric major congenital malformations. And they will be probably at the same places because of the factorial associations. If those babies die, they do usually die not because of the atresia, but because they have also congenital heart disease. And so many of these diseases are systemic diseases. You need a lot of specialists. Even in esophageal atresia, it's good to have a thoracic surgeon. Some babies have this, I don't know the technical part, this collapsing trachea, and there are some surgical techniques which are routinely done by thoracic surgeons. So if this one is close by, you can do the surgery together and you have very good results. So it makes sense. So that's a road to take. And I think it's very important to have representatives of patients who advocate that. I think that's the way to go. You have to say, well, we want that, and we are willing to travel long distances if this results in improved health of our babies.
Thank you.
You have to fight with those doctors, I'm sorry to tell you.
Thank you. There was a clear answer and a clear message, so we would need 10 centers. What do you think of the concept of the surgeon traveling, not the patient?
Well, these diseases are systemic diseases. It's not just a surgeon. You need many specialists and from various disciplines. And you can do that for an isolated problem like gastroschisis. But all the other ones are complex diseases, and you need more than the surgeons. There's a whole bunch of people taking care of these children, and even if they are adults, and they don't travel. I think if you ask parents, they are willing to travel. If they give them a choice, they will travel.
Yeah, that's also one aspect I liked about your talks, because this distance problem is not a real problem. But the low volume centers, they push or pull this card every other day to make their argument for decentralization. And I got another question for Dr. Wilms. I found your study really interesting on that French study on survival, because I was a little shocked that in the year 2024 we argue with survival, right? I mean, it's like when you're buying a car, you would say, okay, my car survives 20 years, right? But when you talk about cars, you talk about comfort, about speed, about quality, but not about survival, right? So I think in the year 2024, survival should not be the only or the main outcome anymore. I mean, a child with EA should survive, period, right? And then we should talk about beyond survival. What do you think?
I totally agree, and that's why I took the quote, because the conclusion that a volume outcome relation for EA surgery doesn't exist, being based on survival, is just not sufficient, regardless of the overall low caseload. The point is, at the moment, we cannot measure any outcomes because we don't have differences in caseload. Yeah, so any outcome, even in the HD study from Sweden, where it was intestinal perforation, any outcome wouldn't be significant because we don't have real high-volume hospitals. But survival should not be the main outcome to measure, but I think it is still significant because it is not as you would expect. I mean, we have in Germany a survival rate of, or a mortality rate of 12%, and I think we need to especially look at the late mortality. Early mortality might be more of a neonatological problem, but the late mortality might be surgery associated. But so the whole field of what the outcome measurement, that is another problem to the rare diseases. That might even be more difficult in the colorectal conditions than it is in EA. But before we go to define outcomes, we need to have real centers to compare high volume and low volume, and that doesn't exist. And I don't think we should be waiting for it. We should do something now, and then we can check later. And when you ask about the number of centers, I just want to say, because I quoted this study from Sweden, and Sweden now has 2 HD centers. And I would always say that, and I think the patient community agrees to that, is there need to be more than one center, no matter how rare the disease is. Because even in Sweden, okay, when they have 20 cases of HD a year, it might be good to have all 20 cases in one center, but one center is never ideal because things can change in a hospital. So, and regardless of the incidence, there should always be more than one center, but we don't need 120.
Thank you. Yeah, and also I agree on the two-center approach because you also need competition, right? This is a natural, people want to compete, and also like in the Netherlands, they had the choice of having 1 oncologic centers and they picked 2 because of the reason to compare, to compete. But there's a question here.
Yes, I have a few questions, if possible, just short ones. Because I'm really for centralization. It's really good, I think. In the Netherlands, we have 3 centers for EA, and I'm really glad with that. But what I hear from many surgeons then, that they think centralization is good, but other people have to give up the profession because EA surgery is so nice surgery to do. So how does it work then? How can you say this hospital can do it and that can't? Do you have to decide it yourself, or does the government say stop with it and other people go on? How would you feel about it if they say your hospital can't do the surgery anymore?
I don't know who wants to answer this question. Yeah,
Okay.
Dr. Wilms
So
wants
I think
to.
we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We know mechanisms of how centralization can work, and there are basically 2 mechanisms, and that is a mandatory minimal case volume or a health reform with structural requirements. And now, okay, we can do anything as patient organization, but I don't know if we can really, in a health reform, reach the goals that we would want to see as quickly as we could with a minimal annual caseload. And the second thing is, in rare diseases, we don't benefit from a health reform as much as the common diseases. Now we have an ongoing health reform in Germany, and it will probably do a lot of good if it eventually comes into effect. But we might just not be affected by all this good because we are just too rare and we go under the radar of what politicians are doing. So I think that is why I'm so much onto this caseload-driven approach. Anything else will follow. Quality of care will follow. Quality of transition of care, aftercare, everything that will follow. But if you don't have case numbers, you don't even need to start to do anything or start to try anything else.
Yeah, yeah, I see what you mean.
That's a great
and
answer. I
know-
just wanted to add, the surgeon needs to follow also. So if a surgeon's dream is to operate esophageal atresia, he has or she has to move, right?
Yeah.
Move to the center.
Yeah.
And there's no argument, no, then I'm not doing it. No, you can do it. You can still do it, but you need to move, right? That is the surgeon answer part. Sorry.
Very good, thank you. The studies, you were talking about studies that the volume doesn't matter in mortality in France and things like that. But I noticed for the, that's about mortality, but the morbidity, I think it makes a big difference. And for patients, for parents, it makes a big difference, is this centralization, because they feel, if the follow-up program and all that kind of things, they feel heard. And in the hospitals where there's just a few amount of patients, they won't get heard. There's not a follow-up program. So from the patient view, it's really good to have centralization. So that would be interesting to take in account for the government or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's what we've been saying for, Soma has been saying that for 35 years, Kees has been saying this for 40 years, but it's just, we need some scientific strong argument. I mean, I would see it as a very strong argument if the whole patient community says we want centralization, but we've been doing that for 4 decades and it hasn't changed anything. So we probably need something more solid than that. Yeah.
Great. If there's no more questions, we move on to the... Oh, sorry.
So, Michaela from Sweden. I enjoyed this discussion very much. Thank you. I agree fully with the discussion about the outcome of survival. I think for these patient group, maybe there are more relevant outcomes or should be. What I wonder is that if it's a paradox to focus so much about the caseload of the initial surgery, but instead of a caseload for the whole team. Because it's not only about the surgeries. We speak so much about the lifelong consideration and the aftercare. So that is also important to add in the word concept of caseload, that there's a team around the patient too. Yeah, thank you.
So the very short answer is that is why we are focused on caseload per hospital and not caseload per surgeon. Because once you have the good structure, the surgical expertise will be regulated. And there are good studies from adult surgery that show that the impact of a high volume center is larger than the impact of a high volume surgeon. So if you have a high volume surgeon operating in a low volume center, his results near the results of the low volume center with a low volume surgeon. Yeah, so totally agreed. It is the expertise of the center that matters. And all the minimal caseload regulations have been in Germany regulated for a center. The legislation could have been on surgeon volume, but it was decided against it. It was always decided for a volume of the caseload of centers.
Thank you.